Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and this week we're going to be discussing masculinity and men's sexuality. I want to offer an important disclaimer as we get into this episode, and that is that while men do also suffer under patriarchy, I don't believe men have it worse than people of other genders. Unfortunately, some people, especially those with more privilege, don't really care about a cause until it affects them personally. If I can get men to recognize the ways that patriarchy harms them, hopefully I can get them to care how it affects others too. Now, that said, masculinity and sexuality are separate constructs. However, gay men have a different relationship to masculinity and femininity because we don't have to fear or hate our femininity. We know that it doesn't make us any less of a man or any less deserving of respect to allow it to exist within us. In social research involving gender, participants used to be offered a scale ranging from highly masculine to highly feminine and were asked to rate their gender identity along this spectrum. Now, masculinity and femininity are not seen to be in opposition, but rather in tandem. So participants might be asked to rate their self-perceived masculinity on one scale and their femininity on another. It's also important to note that behavior does not equal sexuality. This idea is a gross oversimplification provided by systems of oppression like patriarchy. It's really embarrassing how many things have been called gay online in the past decade. Because of how masculinity is associated with heterosexuality, it's implied that a man is less of a man if he doesn't perform masculinity well. I've seen behaviors such as a man eating a popsicle, or using chapstick, or drinking lemonade, somehow, especially if using a straw, or putting his hands on his hips, called gay. I've even seen a video in which a man was tearing up seeing his bride walk down the aisle at their wedding, called gay. Make that make sense. Even behaviors like wearing a seatbelt have been called gay, and the list goes on and on and on. I don't know if you can see right now, and if you're listening, obviously you can't, but I'm wearing glitter eyeshadow right now, and I'm still a man. I paint my nails sometimes. I wear colors like pink or purple. I like to drink pink drinks at bars. I walk with my hips sometimes. I'm attuned to my emotions. I love pop music by women. I have a skincare routine. And I'm still a man. I'm a man because I identify as one, not because other people see me as one. I used to say, back when I was straight, but I don't say that anymore because I realized that even though I experienced the same conditioning as heterosexual men, it resonated differently with me because I'm gay. I never was a heterosexual guy, and the reality is I don't know what that experience is like. I often wonder what level of awareness boys and men have around the pressure to distance themselves from anything feminine and gay and make their heteromasculinity absolutely unquestionable. A big part of being gay is realizing that I don't have to play by those rules and they don't apply to me. One of the ways I think we're conditioned is to believe that being gay is the worst thing you can be. And I think on some level, so-called homophobic hetero men aren't secretly gay themselves, but are upset to see there aren't any natural consequences for us not performing heteromasculinity. That is to say, until hetero men create those consequences. It reminds me of a tweet I saw once that said, transphobes be like, no, you can't transition. Your life is going to be so much harder because of how I'm going to treat you now. You get where I'm going with this. Next, I want to point out that having sex with men doesn't even inherently make a man gay. Many cultures consider the man in the masculine position to still be heterosexual and a man, and the person in the feminine position to be gay or less of a man. The US used to see things this way too, but between the 1930s through the 50s, It shifted so that all involved in sex acts with another man were viewed as gay. The biggest problem with this is that it challenges people's right to self-definition. Public health regularly used the term "men who have sex with men" when promoting men's sexual health, such as HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment, because marketing to gay and bisexual men may exclude men who do have sex with men but don't see themselves as bi or gay. There are some fascinating discussions happening around how men can identify as heterosexual and still enjoy sex with other men, but who am I to say what anyone else is? One of the first areas in which we're going to explore people's right to self-definition is with bisexuality, a sexual orientation that is highly contested, especially when it comes to men. Now, I think that all of the problems experienced by bisexuals are a result of the patriarchy, and the first point to support that argument is that the patriarchy centers attraction, both romantic and sexual, that caters to men. We'll talk about this more in a later episode, but for now, I want to point out that many gays and lesbians do use bisexuality as a stepping stone towards fully coming out, which seems to delegitimize bisexuality, but it is still a valid sexuality in its own right. There are many people who identify as bisexual and are not in denial of some greater truth. The whole point of this right to self-definition is that it isn't ever anyone else's place to define someone's truth for them. In fact, both Freud and Kinsey believed that all people have the predisposition for bisexuality, but that social forces lead people to feel they have to align themselves with heterosexuality or else face the consequences of being labeled homosexual. I think that the Kinsey scale would be a normal distribution if not for these forces like homophobia that lead from hate into tangible violence against sexually minoritized men. Gay men gained visibility from the Stonewall riots, but bisexuals had to push for their own visibility within the community across the 1990s. One major challenge was the either-or thinking that colonialism offers. People are either heterosexual or homosexual. Bisexuals queer this binary, or disrupt it, by saying, no, I'm not both or in between, I'm my own thing. Many bisexual men do present as more heterosexual because it feels safer, and they're often made to feel unwelcome in the LGBT community, so there's no point in risking a more identifiably queer image just to not be accepted. The biphobic assumption that bisexuality isn't real and that men who use that label are just gay men in denial is something that bi people get from both heteros and gays, and further leads to their invisibility and alienation from the LGBT community. Next, I want to talk about some of the challenges that gay men face, the most obvious of which, I believe, is internalized homophobia, or in other words, the shame and low self-worth that gay men grow up with as a result of growing up in a deeply homophobic society. In his book The Velvet Rage, author Alan Downs discusses the means by which young gay boys, often long before they even have the language to name or understand their experience, sense that they are different, and different in a way that they should be ashamed of. For gay men around my age, growing up in the time of AIDS, which of course is not fully behind us, we also received the messaging that as a result of being gay, you will get AIDS, you will deserve it, and you will die, and no one will be sad because you are disgusting. Now, obviously, it's incredibly hard to grow up feeling good about yourself when that's the messaging that you receive, but that is part of the experience of being a gay man today. In The Velvet Rage, Downs addresses some of the behaviors that gay men adopt to offset these feelings of shame and low self-worth, and one of them is through overachievement. I use the term shame-based motivation because it's not that gay men are just more highly motivated than others. It's because we believe that we do not have any value. Many of us will try to achieve greatness in order to offset and sort of create a sense of value that doesn't feel innate. Another challenge that we're faced with is what people think being gay is all about, which includes the hypersexualization of gay men. There are two main problems with this that I want to address. The first is the societal script that gay men are promiscuous, which both becomes permission and a self-fulfilling prophecy for gay men to have a lot of sex with each other. The dark side of this, of course, is the idea that our value comes from our desirability. There are a lot of gay men who put a lot of work into their bodies, thinking, this is how I become a person of value, because we don't get to grow up feeling like we had value. The second prong of this is really just sexualization in general. Gay men's identities, and in fact all LGBTQ identities, are already sexualized. What I mean by this is that it plays into the public-private binary in which the hetero is public and homosexual is private. Being heterosexual is good and normal, while being gay is seen as dirty and deviant. An example of how this plays out is that when a heterosexual married couple says, "We're trying to get pregnant," this is a polite way of saying, "We're having unprotected sex recently." And if a gay couple were to announce that they too were having lots of unprotected sex, people would judge them for that and think it was inappropriate to share. Now, of course, this example seems extreme, but there really are many ways in which what is heterosexual is normalized. It's centered in our society such that when homophobes say things like, "I don't mind you being gay, but I don't understand why you have to make it your entire personality," it's lost on them how much of being heterosexual is their entire personality. You can't see your privilege, and being centered is a privilege. Heterosexuality is everywhere and hidden in plain sight. Another challenge that stems from the sexualization of gay identities is the idea that because it's sexualized, it's therefore inappropriate for children. The Florida legislators who passed the Don't Say Gay bill, and any other people who want to pass similar legislation in their state, act as though teaching 6-year-olds the word gay is akin to showing them porn, which any reasonable person knows are not at all the same. While romantic and sexual attraction are of course a part of the gay identity, I want to be clear that this is not the entirety of the identity. I think another important component that often is left out of this discussion is our relationship to femininity. As part of the homophobia we endure, we are often taught to be ashamed of the femininity in us, but ultimately, I believe that being gay is an invitation to make peace with all parts of ourselves. I think the gay men who have done the work are often much more well-adjusted than heterosexual men and gay men who haven't done this work, because masculinity and femininity exist in all of us to varying degrees. A big part of the heterosexual male identity is distancing themselves from femininity, whereas gay men have given ourselves permission to embrace that part of ourselves. People like to talk about the sexualization of kids. They'll say, "It's okay that you want to be gay, just leave the kids out of it," as though LGBT people magically become LGBT on their 18th birthday and weren't born that way. Some close-minded parents say things like, "Not in my house," and LGBT youth are disproportionately represented among people experiencing homelessness as a result of their parents' intolerance. These types of parents are able to believe that minors aren't ever LGBT because their queer youth hid parts of themselves from their parents for safety, and no kid should ever have to worry about whether they'll still have a roof over their head for being honest about who they are. Now, Having just discussed that gay men have the opportunity to be more comfortable with the masculinity and femininity in themselves, it seems like the perfect lead-in to a brief discussion of the pressures of heterosexual men. It should go without saying that this category of men is incredibly privileged, but I do believe that they are also robbed of a full personhood. In his 1993 book, The Myth of Male Power, author Warren Farrell says that he believes the pressure men face to be providers precludes their ability to self-reflect, and that men often feel they can't share about challenges at work for fear their wives will think he's about to get laid off and leave him to find someone better suited to providing. I believe there's a lot of merit to this message. However, I also think things are shifting, especially as costs are rising and women are gaining power of their own and not necessarily expecting a man to provide for them, at least not fully. That said, this pressure to provide is not fully gone from the male role. Heterosexual men's value is seen as coming from their ability to protect and provide. I personally also think one of the primary reasons why men are less self-aware than women is because of gender-based violence. When girls are taught at a young age that the world is not a safe place for them, that men may want to take advantage of them, and that it doesn't matter if they're underage, it creates a huge difference in how boys and girls move through the world. Similarly, Black kids get taught that the world isn't a safe place for them either. It's another sign of privilege to be safe in this world. Now, of course, it's great that heterosexual men get to grow up feeling safe. We should all get to. But the obvious downside of this is a lack of self-awareness towards the realities of the world. As I discussed in the introductory episode of this series, theory bros are somewhat detached from most people's lived reality because the world is mostly a safe place for them. In her Netflix special, Nanette, Hannah Gadsby talks about an instance in which she was physically assaulted by a man and says the other women in the audience have a knowing understanding of also being harmed by men, while the men are probably hearing and thinking, an isolated incident. Because the world is a safe place for heterosexual men, and they have no reason to think otherwise, they generally don't critically self-reflect, and, in fact, are given every distraction from doing so. Again, because their sexuality is centered, it may not feel so obvious to them, but there are generally multiple sporting events occurring at the same time on TV. I used to have a roommate who would watch sports on TV about 6 times a week, and one time I even saw him watching golf. So when I told a friend this, they said, "That man is so scared of having a thought that he's even going to watch golf. No one enjoys watching golf." Again, I don't know what it's like to be a heterosexual man, but I have researched masculinity a lot and worked primarily with men in therapy the past few years, so I've learned a lot about the challenges that men face. I think heterosexual men are generally not taught to acknowledge struggling without it being framed as them failing at masculinity, and we all struggle sometimes. Earlier I mentioned men who have sex with men and yet identify as heterosexual, and I think that this happens for a few reasons. I think a big part of this is having a narrow image of what being gay means. Some likely think of gay men in stereotypical ways, and because they don't see themselves in that stereotype, they think that they aren't gay. And then there are those who do not and will not experience romantic attraction towards men. While often romantic and sexual attraction go hand in hand, they don't always. For example, I'm biromantic. I can have romantic feelings for both men and women, but I only experience same-sex sexual attraction, so it's easier for me to just call myself gay. I don't want to have a romantic relationship with a woman and never have sex with my partner. For those among men who have sex with men and yet identify as heterosexual, there are some who are actually gay but are lying to themselves or just haven't figured it out yet. But that risk of coming out may disincentivize them from working towards seeing themselves as gay. They know that being gay or bi means they won't be as safe in the world, and they're not ready to give up that part of their privilege. The last thing I want to add to this discussion is the intersectionality of how men experience sexual orientation by race. Because of respectability politics and white supremacy, men of color are already in a one-down position compared to white men. They are othered within white supremacy and have to work against biases that don't respect their humanity. So often, being gay is seen as some white people shit. Because of the added layer of homophobia, being gay would be like another strike against them, so it's often harder for minoritized men to come to terms with being gay. Because white Western society sees coming out as the pinnacle of mental health for LGBT people, there's often calls for honoring your authenticity and cutting ties with everyone who doesn't support your truth. This is nice in theory, but because white culture is already against people of color, gay people of color often can't afford to simply cut ties with their community, even if that means hiding parts of themselves or enduring homophobia from their family. In a perfect world, no one would have to hide any part of themselves. But gay people of color can't hide their skin color, so they may feel the need to hide their sexuality so as not to become even less safe in the world. Until next time, I'm Jake Ryan, and this has been Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.